When it comes to ear tips, would you say you're a small, a medium, or a large kind of person? And before you answer that question, it's a trick question because in my opinion, it is a lot more complicated than that. Hey folks, I'm Mark Ryan, this is Super Review, and I've been wearing IEMs for years. At home, at the office, while traveling, and even while sleeping. And I found that finding the right ear tip for my IEMs can be a make it or break it factor when it comes to how much I enjoy that earphone. And in this episode of Waveguide, I'm going to talk about some of my favorite heuristics, my tips for finding the best tips for my IEMs that hopefully can help you out. And I think something like this will be useful not just to somebody who's getting into the hobby, for whom I think this will be super useful, but also for someone who is already deep into this hobby. And while we're going to get a little bit technical, I've got illustrations of ears and stuff here, I do want to give a little bit of a caveat that this is not going to be a scientific episode of Waveguide. This is all based on my own experiences, my own heuristics and tips, not necessarily backed up by science. Maybe one day we'll get there, but for now, this is what we're going to be talking about. And if you like content like this, well, shout out to our sponsor, HiFiGo. HiFiGo is making Waveguide possible, and they are an online retailer that's also making hi-fi audio affordable and attainable for everyone. And if you want to check them out, show your support, I've got them linked down below. Most of the stuff that we're going to be talking about in this video, you can find available for sale on HiFiGo. But with that said, let's dig into it. And by dig into it, I mean, let's dig into the ear. So I wanted to start by just talking about why it's important to find the right ear tip for your IEM. And some of this is going to be pretty obvious, but maybe not all of it. And I think it comes down to two factors. It's going to come down to fit and comfort, and it's going to come down to sound. So when it comes to fit and comfort, we're talking about, how well does it fit into your ear hole? How comfortable are you having it there all the time or for as long as you want to listen to an IEM? And then also, how stable is it going to be? Is it going to be something where the earphone is falling out of your ear over time, or is it going to be nice and stable and just hold itself in place? These are things that you can affect with the right ear tip. And then when it comes to sound, yeah, you can actually affect the sound of an IEM just by swapping out the ear tips. Going from a small to a large, for example, might give you a different fit, but it's also going to give you a slightly different sound. And now it's not going to be drastically different sounds, but some things like sibilants, so like the harsh sounds of S's and T's, which you might have just heard me saying right there, that kind of thing can be dialed in a lot of the times by switching out ear tips, or even just getting a little bit more incisiveness in the attack on treble instruments, as well as frankly even bass instruments, you can get with the right ear tip. Again, it's not going to be completely transformative, but if you've got an IEM that you already like quite a bit, and you're just looking to make kind of that last little bit of adjustment for yourself, an ear tip is a good way to do that. So let's dive deeper into those, starting with the earphone fit. And when it comes to fit, I kind of start with two main questions for myself. Question number one is, which part of my ear, or which part of the earphone is responsible for the stability? What is creating kind of that retention inside of my ear? And then question number two is, am I going for a shallow fit or a deep fit? And both of these questions are like largely dependent on the shape and the construction of the IEM, but also to some degree, you get a little bit of choice in the matter. So let's start with that first question, the fit stability or the retention. What's creating that? And for that, I have a little bit of an illustration over here. So we've got an ear. In fact, let me punch up here real quick, just to kind of highlight the parts of the ear that we're talking about. So we've got the concha bowl, right? Zoom in there. This is my concha bowl. It's kind of like the outer ear. It's definitely the outer ear. Again, I promise we're not going to be scientific, but this is kind of like the outer ear. And then over here in red, we've got the ear canal, which is deeper into your ear. And this is just kind of highlighting different ways that an IEM can fit. You might have an IEM that's got kind of like a semi-custom molded design, like this moondrop dusk right here, where the folds of this IEM kind of neatly lay into the folds of the concha bowl, and they create stability just by fitting into the concha bowl. But then there's some other IEMs, kind of like this Tantrum Hana, where there's not that semi-custom molded shape, and really this thing sitting inside of your concha bowl, there's no fit stability coming from that at all. In fact, all the fit stability is going to come from where the ear tip connects with your ear canal, which might happen here in kind of like the outer part of your ear canal, or it might happen a little bit deeper in your ear canal. And again, here it's going to be related somewhat to the shape of the IEM and the construction of it, but again, also a little bit down to fit preferences. So here's a couple of heuristics that I have generally, all right? If you're wearing an IEM that is the fit stability is dependent on the conchable and like you've got the semi-custom molded shape, you have a lot more flexibility generally when it comes to what type of earphone or what type of ear tip you want to use. It doesn't necessarily need to be especially grippy because again, the ear tip is not doing much of the retention. It's your ear itself that's doing the retention. So yeah, you get a lot more flexibility over here. But when it comes to an earphone that fits like this, where it's creating that stability with the ear tip, here's where I think you need to get a little bit more picky about your ear tips. So for one, some ear tips will come in, and maybe I can highlight this here, kind of a difference between more of a pointed shape IEM or ear tip. You can see where it's wider at the bottom and narrower at the top, or you can have kind of this rounder balloon shaped earphone or ear tip, where it's actually a little bit wider in the middle than it is at the bottom. And I find that that rounded shape can actually be really good for creating additional fit stability here in this part of the ear canal. And that's actually why I've got this little transformer toy up here, is that it kind of reminds me of like a ball and socket joint, right? We're gonna get a little bit private, but basically this part of my ear, you can kind of see like it has like this little ball socket effect right there. By adding a rounded ear tip to that part of my ear, you're getting like kind of the grippy effect of a ball socket joint. So it just helps hold it in place. Some other things that you might want to consider when you're wearing an earphone with this style of fit is that having a little bit of extra tackiness or grip on the ear tip can be pretty beneficial. So if we're going like here, like this is not a particularly tacky ear tip. This one, Soft Ears Ultra Clear, is pretty tacky. I find that spin fits tend to be pretty tacky, but then something like this, this is the Divinus Velvet, not very tacky. So that's something to consider if you're, again, going for a fit that is like this, where it's dependent on the grip of the ear tip, creating that stability. It can be beneficial to have a little bit of an additional tackiness on there. So that gives you an idea how to dial in kind of the fit stability aspects, but then there's also kind of the depth, right? Do you want it to be a shallow fit or a deep fit or kind of a middle of the road fit? And to some degree, you get actually some flexibility in this regard, right? It can be up to personal preference if the shape of the IEM allows. And we'll talk about the sound impacts that this can have on it. But let's just kind of assume that you're starting from the perspective of you want a middle of the road fit. Some things to keep in mind, right? If you've got an IEM that's got a nozzle that's slightly on the long side, pick an ear tip that's a little bit shallow, right? And then conversely, if you're starting with an IEM that's got somewhat of a shallow nozzle or a really short nozzle, go with an ear tip that can kind of elongate that and give you a little bit more reach to get a better grip on your ear canal. Although I will highlight, this is actually an area where you've got some flexibility. Let's say you've got a short earphone, and let me just fit it into this ear as an example. All right, you can actually sometimes get just as good of a fit by using a shorter ear tip that's also wider, all right? So like in this case, I'm using a small ear tip, which is a little bit on the long side, so it's able to reach in and get slightly deeper fit. But you might be more comfortable with a wider fit, a wider fitting ear tip that's not going quite as deep, and maybe it's just fitting into this little knuckle right there. And that's just another alternative way that you can adjust kind of the fit depth depending on which ear tip you go with. Anything else I wanted to talk about here? No, just generally that if you're going for a shallower fit, for me at least, my experience is that a wider ear tip works well, so a large ear tip. But if you're going for a deeper fit, try out the smaller ear tips. So at this point, you're probably asking yourself, do I want a shallow fit? Do I want a deep fit? Is one better than the other? And I think the first point is just to say, pick your personal preference. Whatever fits most comfortable for you and what also fits the most stable, I would say is probably the biggest priority. But there can also be an effect on the sound, and it's not that deeper is always better or shallow is always better. It really is kind of complicated. And I guess just to kind of highlight this, here's an illustration, right, of the same Moondrop Dusk that we've got fitted over here on the left with a large ear tip. And because it's got a large ear tip, it's kind of bottoming out earlier in the ear canal and you're getting a more shallow fit. Whereas over here on the right, we've got the same IEM, but with a smaller ear tip, which allows us to get a deeper fit. And the big difference that you're going to notice is kind of like the distance between the end of the ear tip and this highly accurate illustration of an eardrum. It changes, right? Here with the shallower fit, you've got a longer length mode. a longer length between the earphone and your eardrum, and that has impacts on the sound. And if you don't believe me, well, we've got measurements to back this one up. So here's a frequency response graph of a Dunu brain dance. And if you're used to looking at these graphs, you're probably used to seeing that there's almost always a peak at 8 kilohertz. That's intentional. We do that on purpose. That's basically, this is a peak in the frequency response that appears depending on how deep I insert the IEM into the measurement rig that I'm using. But as I'm going with a shallower or a deeper fit, you can see that the treble actually changes, the frequency response changes. So here's an example of what this same IEM measures like with a shallower fit. And you can see that you get actually quite a bit more treble in this kind of, let's call it like 5 to 7.5 kilohertz range, but you also get significantly less treble in this upper range. And you can see that even more exaggerated if you baseline the data. So this is the exact same data down here, just with the original measurement as the baseline. And you can see that we've moved a peak over here to about 7.5 kilohertz, and we get kind of a dip at around 8.5 kilohertz. And this can actually have some pretty significant impact as it turns out when it comes to, again, sounds like sibilance, right? The harshness of S's and T's. But it can also have maybe a positive impact in terms of increasing the incisiveness, the attack on certain instruments. But that same effect can also happen if you go with a deeper insert. So this is just an illustration showing that deeper insert is also kind of going to have a very similar effect. It's just going to move that peak deeper in to your ear canal and deeper in the frequency response. So here you can kind of see, again, baselined. Now we're getting a dip at 8 kilohertz and we're getting a peak at around 9.5 kilohertz. And again, these can just have pretty meaningful impact in terms of your perception of the sound. Is it going to be a drastic night and day difference? Probably not. But if it's an IEM that has, a lot of things you like, and it's really close to being perfect, but it's got maybe a little bit of a softness in the attack, or maybe a little bit too aggressive in the S's and the T's, dialing in that depth can make all the difference. So I wanted to end this video by just kind of highlighting some of my favorite go-to ear tips. And that's what I've got here on the table and why I choose them. And if you want to dive into this yourself, I've actually kind of put together this little diagram where I plot these ear tips on a scale of pointy to round and short to long to, hopefully you can use with the tips that I gave earlier to pick out which ear tip is going to work for you given your situation and your particular IEM. But yeah, just to kind of quickly go through these, this is the FiO HS18. And I like this one a lot because it's narrow and it's short, but it gives you that pointy shape. So for me, this works really well on an IEM that's got kind of a long nozzle, but I want it to still fit nice and deep. That's what the HS18 is really good for. This is the Soft Ears Ultra Clear, which is a little bit longer, but also kind of similarly pointy. And this one I find works better on IEMs that have a shorter nozzle, not so well on IEMs that have a longer nozzle. Similarly, this is the SpinFit W1. In fact, I kind of use these two tips fairly interchangeably. This is also kind of like a narrow, pointy tip that's a little bit on the long side. The nozzle's a little bit long. So for me, this works better on an IEM that has a short nozzle if I'm trying to elongate it. Over here, we've got the AudioSense. I believe it's called the S400. I think this is an underrated ear tip. It's got a nice tackiness to it, a nice grip level to it. And it's also got kind of like a SpinFit style, like a rotational mechanism inside of it, which I think is pretty nice. It's also a little bit on the pointy side, and I find that this works pretty well with a lot of different nozzle lengths, but I would say medium length nozzle is kind of where this is ideal. Over here, we've got the SpinFit CP100. This ear tip's been around for years. This is one of the longer ear tips, right? So if I have a short IEM that I'm trying to give it extra reach into my ear canal, the CP100 is just one of my go-tos. One, it's got a nice tackiness to the silicone that they use on it, but it also has kind of a nice rounded shape to it, which can help with some of those shallower fitting IEMs. Over here, we've got the SpinFit CP360, which this one actually might be kind of hard to find, although I did see that HiFiGo still has some in stock. This one I like because it is nice shallow fitting IEM. So this works well with, this is a nice shallow fitting tip, which works well with IEMs that have kind of like a long nozzle. If you don't want to add increased length to that nozzle, this little tip is actually pretty good. And it gives you kind of a nice general rounded shape. Not overly rounded, but pretty rounded, more rounded than pointy. Here we've got TRN's, I believe they're called the T-ear ear tip. I think this one's kind of underrated. This is one I've just discovered fairly recently, and it's got this really nice rounded bulb shape. So it works really well in terms of fitting into, again, that kind of knuckle of my ear canal entrance. But it's also on the short side, so it kind of solves a unique problem. And so it works well with an IEM that's got kind of like a long nozzle on it. But then if you go with a smaller ear tip, you can get like a nice deep fit on a shot. Like, oh, this is kind of a nice go-to. But again, I would describe this as kind of on the shorter, rounder side. Here we've got the Divinus Velvet. This is just a go-to for a lot of audiophiles. This one I would describe as very much a rounded kind of balloon shape ear tip. You can see there as I turn it to the side. And I would also say that this one is slightly on the long side, kind of similar to the SpinFit W1 here. Kind of similar in terms of length. This is just going to be the more rounded shape, and that's going to be the more conical, pointy shape. Similarly, over here with the JVC spiral dots, they have a really nice texture, a really nice tactility, tackiness to them. And they've also got kind of this rounded umbrella shape to them. So they are very much in the round area. In terms of depth-wise, I would say they're a little bit on the shallow side in terms of fit depth, but more or less kind of middle of the road. So this will work well on either a really long nozzle or an average size nozzle. Over here, we've got another ear tip that I think is underrated. This is the NF Audio MS42, which is just a mess of letters and numbers, but this has just been a tip that I've been putting on a lot of my favorite IEMs lately. It's got kind of this wide umbrella, a little bit of a roundness to it, but it doesn't quite have the bulbousness of these other tips over here. But instead what it has is it's just got a little bit extra shortness. So depending, again, if you're going with a long nozzle, but you kind of want that shallow fit, something like this works really well. But also with the smaller sizes, going with a longer nozzle and a smaller size, I'm getting a really nice sense of tactility out of this. I don't know how transferable that kind of impression is for other people, but generally, I've just found this tip is working really well for me for a lot of stuff. And the last thing I wanted to highlight over here, this is Divinus Velvet TWS ear tip. To be honest, I don't use this one that much, but this is like a very specialty ear tip. Okay, it's made for TWS, but what that means is it is super, super shallow. The most shallow ear tip you can find. So if you have a nozzle that is particularly long and maybe it's too long for you and you're trying to get comfort out of it, going with this ear tip, the TWS version of the Velvet, might actually get you that. So there you have it. Those are my core heuristics, or kind of my basic tips for finding the best tips for my IEMs. Now, fair warning, this can turn into a little bit of an obsession. You might end up with way too many ear tips like I have, but it's not such a bad thing. But you also don't need to go overboard. I just think it's good to have on hand a handful of different types of ear tips that have different qualities, different attributes, so that you can match them to your earphones. And you might find that they're going to improve the fit comfort, fit stability, and sometimes even the sound. And if you want to check out any of these particular ear tips, I'll have them linked below. A lot of these are available in HiFiGo. I'll have them all linked below, which is, I guess, just a reminder that thanks to HiFiGo for sponsoring this content. If you want to check them out, I've got them linked down below. And while you're down there, if you haven't already, please do hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, ding the YouTube bell, join me on Discord, and I'll catch you on the next super review. Cheers.
Join with the force of reviews. We now have the tools to brave the misleading world of audio fools. Hey, this review is super, and so are you. Grab your headphones, sniff a graph, and share your thoughts in this pursuit. Let's get